everybody. Reporting to you again from the Glamour City, Hollywood.
It's a whole nother level to be out in the community, working with the community, testing the solutions, getting feedback, and seeing those applications come to life. And I would say what's great is that, the researchers are part of the community themselves as well, right? They live here, they work here. And so they bring that level of expertise and lived experience that is also helpful to inform and drive the innovation with the community hand in hand. And I think that has been a real welcome addition and actually allowed researchers to be more competitive in getting larger federal grants or corporate opportunities because they have demonstrated success working with the community and been able to showcase their findings.
If you love listening to this show, please consider giving a rating and a review on Amazon Alexa or wherever you listen. We want to continue bringing you this amazing content, and part of our ability to do that means that we need a big audience. Now, it may not seem like much, but rating and reviewing the show will help more people find us, just like how you found this show. Simply on any podcast platform, search for a show, scroll down to the bottom, and push 5 stars. It's that easy. Thanks for supporting the show. Today, I'm joined by Debra Lam, founding director of the Partnership for Inclusive Innovation. Welcome to the show today.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
Debra, what do you believe Georgia is inherently, from a comparative advantage, better vis-a-vis other states?
Actually, I think what's been really exciting about Georgia is a few things. One, I find it as actually not a Georgia native, a very welcoming place. Two, I think there's a lot of energy for collaboration and coalition building, especially for the greater good for the state. And three, I'm sure we'll talk about this later on, there's a lot of opportunity to leverage and galvanize in terms of what Georgia can do around innovation and technology.
So we're very excited to talk about what Georgia is doing and certainly what your organization is doing specifically to help really take Georgia to the next level. But I want to take a step back and ask, from a state, maybe from a socioeconomic or just kind of a historic perspective, what are some of the inherent challenges that Georgia has had to deal with over the last century or so?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think Georgia is an exception to this, but I do think we have a lot to celebrate in Georgia around the growth and innovation and technology. But that historically has not been celebrated equally across the state. There's an inherent inequality between, those that may be in Atlanta, might be in certain industries, might be in certain communities, demographics, et cetera, and those that are outside. So what we believe at the partnership is, how do you ensure that inclusive innovation is accounting for the geographic diversity of the state, meaning in rural and urban and everything in between? And that, if it can be done in one place, how can we replicate it, model it, scale it, and expand it to other places to ensure that the opportunities and the celebrations that can be done can be shared?
Now, from a backdrop is that fairly recently, the U.S. Supreme Court has essentially overruled Harvard's college admission practice around affirmative action, and that's going to have a pretty detrimental effect when it comes to Hispanics, Blacks, for example, getting into top schools. How do you feel that, again, this isn't the primary focus of today's conversation, but from a backdrop, how does that potentially deter or make it challenging for your organization to have that inclusivity within Georgia?
I'll say this. We define inclusive innovation as increasing access and opportunities for everyone to innovate. But that innovation isn't an end state. It's a way to drive shared economic prosperity. We're certainly not the only group doing this, and we certainly don't want to be the only group doing this. But how we've defined inclusive innovation, and this is very much based on the research that we've done, and as you are familiar with Silicon Valley or the Boston corridors, if we are more intentional at the beginning in terms of including more people, understanding the locality, we can actually be stronger in forming more sustainable outcomes at the end. And that's essentially the heart of the partnership. How can we utilize innovation as a tool, but innovation as a tool that's localized to meet the needs of the community, to empower the community, to then drive shared economic prosperity.
So we have seen this type of model work not just within the U.S. domestic states and some of the references that you made, but also overseas as well. So that intentionality and creating economic zones, creating that public-private partnership, even consortiums, for example, especially working with the research institutions to allow for the types of innovations that were typically kind of housed within, let's say, university boundary, and allow that to come out to the community so that they can start to embrace it and foster that localized competitiveness that is unique to the region. And specifically when we talk about when we say Georgia, although it's the entire state, I believe your organization is focused on coastal Chatham County and city of Savannah. Is that right?
Yeah, so I will say that our public-private partnership might be a little bit different than what you're familiar with the economic zones and whatnot, and we looked at this ourselves as well. We kind of define those public-private partnerships as first-generation public-private partnerships, right? You're focused on funding and financing a very technical legal term of large mega infrastructure, right? Whether that's a bridge or a dam or really moving physical infrastructure over a fixed or limited period of time. Right. We think of public-private partnership really centered on community driven partnership, where it's a series of projects versus one big mega project. And those series of projects are used to build not only the physical infrastructure, but the digital and the social infrastructure. How do you integrate those larger levels of infrastructure together that benefit the community? And the currency isn't so much just a financial transaction. It's a financial transaction that's coupled with social capital, and really thinking about it based on a series of relationships over a longer period of time. And how we have driven public-private partnerships is based on those relationships that would improve, again, the shared economic prosperity of that locality. And based on that definition, we really think it's a slight evolution of your traditional public-private partnership.
Yeah, I think the way you define it is actually more common. It's kind of the latest practice, and that's certainly what I've seen versus the typical 100 years ago, let's say, infrastructure based on civil engineering. And specifically, we're talking about the ability to incorporate things like the Georgia Mesh Network, as well as digital literacy, and kind of this bigger context of smart cities. Isn't that right?
Yeah, and I'll be remiss. I want to answer your question on the Chatham project as well. So that is a very good example of how we see it. Is one, as you know, coastal Georgia, like many coasts, are suffering from increased hurricane and severities, increased frequency of hurricanes, and it's getting more severe. This is just as the world is evolving. The current market out there does not account for sea level rise, sensors, right? This does not quite allow for planning and response. So the team that we pulled together developed and manufactured a smart sea level sensor, then placed it in lots of different public infrastructures around the county, and then they collected data in an open source model, which then informed the planning and emergency response of the community. So that was everything from design and manufacturing all the way up to implementation and policy making. But what was also great is that project included a strong education and community engagement component. What I mean by that is that it had extensive stakeholder engagement with the community so that they could better feed back into the project and understand the project. It also included curriculum development, where high school STEAM classes could put the smart sea level sensor together. And it was also included in third grade learning about weather and hurricanes, etc. So how do you move beyond just a standard, what is the problem, addressing the hurricanes, into a larger community education outreach?
And I think the way you explained it is a really beautiful case study of how it should be done, right? The level of involvement from the different parties, and just the fact that you're not just simply passing out pamphlets, but there's actually really immersive education. And certainly for the youth, they're growing up with it, and it becomes part of their DNA in terms of how they think about the world. And I love the fact that the problem solving, instead of trying to take it from a very large infrastructure, you're taking it from fairly easy, fairly low cost types of sensor capabilities, and then really focusing on harnessing the data and making that open source.
Well said. What I really also like about it, it's an empowering the community, right? Not every community has an innovation department or has R&D in their unit, right? You might not have that level of expertise or even capacity or time. And so for a lot of these communities, how can they innovate? How can they get access to this? And our theory is we want to share this with you, but we're not coming in with the answers. We're not coming in only with, a single solution. We want to work with you together on this so you are empowered by the innovation, and then ultimately you own it.
And I think sometimes when people talk about smart cities, they get lost in the technology and the interoperability and the different protocols. But the value is, to your point, it's not only just harnessing, gathering all these multimodal data sets, but the ability to actually then furnish that from an open data to the public so that they can start to use that data for monetization, as well as innovation and development that meets their specific needs. And that's very exciting. I want to transition to talk specifically about not just from a reactive or preventive response from hurricanes and extreme weathers, but also from agriculture. I believe some of the work that you guys do impacts smaller and mid-sized farms as well, right?
Yeah, we're really excited about our ag tech portfolio. We have a few projects that fall into that, but there's a couple of projects I'll just highlight. One is that around precision agriculture or agricultural technology, a lot of that development has been done at the large scale industrial level. And that's great. But actually, as you know, a majority of the farmers are small, medium-sized producers. And agriculture remains a huge industry in Georgia and other states. I would say. And so what we wanted to look at was how can we ensure that small and medium-sized producers also have the digital literacy or the know-how to really think about precision agriculture or agricultural technology. And this includes water conservation, soil conservation. How do you crop the land, or how do you plant the produce? How are there different methods that could inform your planting strategy that's informed by data that would allow you to know how to interpret the data? We talk about data a lot, as you noted, but for as much as we talk about data, there's no doubt that there's plenty of data. We're drowning in data. That how you actually apply the data and interpret that data, that literacy sometimes gets missed or fallen behind just the overwhelming sense that we need more data and we need to, access it and open source it, etc. But to me, I think the missing part is how to ensure that the literacy goes hand in hand with the data integration or modeling or access.
And I think you make an excellent point, and specifically the regional area that you're talking about. When you think about the smaller, mid-sized farmers, their background isn't necessarily engineering or science. Their background is probably in agriculture or something to that extent. Now, they're very good at what they do, but looking at interpreting and then making informed decisions with the data is something different. So literacy, I think, is incredibly important. But I think the other piece that, of course, inherently accompanies it is a behavioral change, because they're so used to getting up at 4, 5, 6 in the morning, doing their chores, and they're so exhausted. The last thing they're going to do is open up their mobile apps or the laptop to start looking at data and analyzing and then changing their behavior accordingly. That's a pretty big change. So from a literacy perspective, how do you incorporate the change management?
Yeah, it involves actually classes and teaching, but also meeting them where they are. So for the first part of the project that, was done by the University of Georgia and Abraham Baldwin Agricultural College, the two universities in Georgia, was surveying and understanding, creating a baseline, if you will. How do the small and medium-sized producers currently use data? What do they know about it? What is their, work of habit that would allow them to actually make these informed decisions? And then what they've done is develop the curriculum that actually meets the needs of the farmers based on where they are. And that, to your point, addresses the gap between just the education and the actual behavioral change. We want to be able to create the models that would incentivize them to actually make those changes based on the data, using our understanding of how they actually approach it to begin with.
And again, in the context of climate change, this is even more paramount than ever. Now, you've already mentioned University of Georgia, Georgia Tech, and it's clear that your organization, with many other organizations, work with colleges, universities, and researchers. And I think the thing that's really exciting is these are practical applications. These are not just theoretical work. And certainly for the researchers and the students, they get to actually apply it in real life situations and case studies that actually make a big difference. And I wonder how the researchers that are involved in some of these public-private coalitions, how they've gained aside from just the insights and the research that they're doing.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. How we have approached it is that, within the university structure and the system, as you know, there's certain pathways in which you will get promoted and elevated, and that sometimes interferes with outreach with the community. What we want to be able to show is that you can still do really good, meaningful research that can advance the research, but make an impact on the community. Right. So, you can talk about a lot of this in the theoretical sense. You can test it in the laboratory. You can kind of talk about it, within your research institutes. But it's a whole nother level to be out in the community, working with the community, testing the solutions, getting feedback, and seeing those applications come to life. And I would say what's great is that, the researchers are part of the community themselves as well, right? They live here, they work here. And so they bring that level of expertise and lived experience that is also helpful to inform and drive the innovation with the community hand in hand. And I think that has been a real welcome addition, and actually allowed researchers to be more competitive in getting larger federal grants or corporate opportunities, because they have demonstrated success working with the community and been able to showcase their findings.
Terrific win-win. And certainly from a venture capital perspective is that, we see a lot of startups that come with great ideas, but it's fairly conceptual and theoretical. And the ones that actually end up succeeding longer term is the ones that from the get-go really understood market fit. And what's exciting about this is you guys have created essentially a living lab, a test bed, and that's a perfect place where you can really understand some of the complexities, frictions, and the opportunities as a result of those, and how to actually solve it in a way that really brings and infuses innovation. So to that point, your organization, the partnership, has deployed some $3 million in capital throughout Georgia. I want to see if there are other types of projects you want to highlight and how that's really helped not just Georgia, but perhaps even beyond.
Yeah, well, one of the aspects, we talked a little bit about the research side, but one of the aspects that we have is building the next generation of innovators. And what we mean by that is, we see the next generation of innovators needing to navigate fluently public-private partnerships, being able to be more aware about the public good and, public innovation and civic tech, and being able to really latch on to these emerging and growing industries in Georgia and beyond. And this includes AI manufacturing, cybersecurity, precision agriculture, all these major growth areas and be able to fluently talk about them and deal with the opportunities and challenges that come about. So to that end, we created a major summer internship program where students can be actively learning about these concepts, but also on the ground working with the community, with the private sector, with the corporate sector on these projects. We've taken 3 levels of intersectionality. So these are students that are any year in higher ed, rising sophomores all the way up to PhD students, any major, hard sciences with the soft sciences coming together, and now any university in the country. So when we first started this, we had 5 students, all working on 4 projects, all from Georgia Tech. This summer, we are going to graduate in a couple weeks, 62 students from 25 colleges and universities from 12 states, countries, continents, etc. So they're working on 35 projects in Georgia and beyond Georgia. We had, additional organizations and host sites that had to match in terms of funding. They also had to apply. So we know that it's a meaningful experience for the students. And that's how we think about transformative change in terms of experiential learning, public innovation, and really thinking about next generation innovators.
And what I love about this is the notion is very intentional, because when we talk about public-private partnerships and civic good and so forth, and public good even, a lot of these intangibles are very difficult to learn. So if one comes from, let's say, STEM or STEAM background, they're not going to be exposed to that. So they may be very fluent in their language of mathematics and science, but they may not really understand how that translates and communicate that in a way that makes sense and resonates with the actual people that are in the community that needs that desperately. So this is a very practical, hands-on. Again, we see a lot of these similar programs, but the fact is it's very localized. So I want to ask you, out of the 24 new businesses that have been created, give us a sense of some of those businesses and the localized flavor of those businesses.
Yeah, I will actually bring that back with even some of the next generation innovators that we're starting to see in terms of industry growth and new businesses. So another program we have is around workforce development, and it's addressing the problem that we see, which is the chicken and egg, where young professionals find it hard to get their first job without work experience, and they can't get work experience without the first job. So, how do we translate them into actually meaningful career path going forward, especially around what we see as a growth industry? So we developed a fellowship program, a year-long fellowship program, where they spent 6 months in the private sector, 6 months in the public sector, along key growth industries. So they know not only the different cultures, the different agendas in any organization, but they're really developing subject matter expertise. And along your question around the new businesses and areas of growth, we actually see is in AI manufacturing. Right. So traditional manufacturing, as you can see, is again, a very important part of Georgia and the industry. But, we were able to place a fellow in AI manufacturing. And she is a young lady who graduated recently from Spelman College. Right. But she already started to see, in order for us to do AI manufacturing really well, we have to start younger. So how do we start getting this in the K through 12? What kind of education curriculum do we need to do? And just spearheading that as part of a larger AI manufacturing effort. And I don't think that would have happened if she wasn't placed as a fellow. And another part is that she comes from a social sciences background. AI manufacturing traditionally is a very engineering type background, but with her social sciences, she's able to complement that and ask some larger questions in terms of how do you build a larger pipeline to get more people with the right skill sets, equipping to build a larger kind of industry around AI manufacturing. So again, that intentionally putting people into these places that might not have the exact skill sets, but to grow and to really feed out produces additional opportunities beyond that scope of work that you may have intended.
And as I'm listening, what's really exciting is I think historically, when people think about manufacturing, it's blue collar work, it's pretty much just hands and so forth. But infusing AI from design and engineering and specifications to even optimization aspects, and then when you take into account the physical medical in the sense of manifestation of robotics, for example, motion planning and so forth, it starts to get fairly complex. And you're basically transforming that industry from blue collar to almost white collar and advanced skill capability and enhanced
Higher
skill
paid,
set.
better work.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. So it really is fundamental, and that could really transform all of Georgia. So my final question for you is, if everything goes accordingly to not just your organization, but all the different organizations that you work with, 30 years from now, how could Georgia look different from today?
First of all, I would say that we would have really looked at narrowing the inequality, going back to where we started at the beginning. Like Georgia would be very different in terms of the inequality that we're seeing. There would be less separation in that regard. Secondly, I think there would be a greater ecosystem of innovators. And what that means is that there's a greater sense of sharing and collaborating for that larger economic prosperity. And then thirdly, I think hopefully we will continue to be as welcoming, as we said earlier, to allow for, more venture capital, more startups, more dynamic small businesses, more young leaders to come together and for them to see that they have a role to play and they have a space and an opportunity to grow. That's the dynamic kind of innovation that we would love to see, where we are obviously building this. We certainly have a lot going for us already. But, if you're acting for 30 years from now, I hope to build that stronger ecosystem that allows for more of that to happen.
So with that, I have been joined by Debra Lam, founding director of the Partnership for Inclusive Innovation. Thank you for joining today.
Thank you.
If you've enjoyed this episode, take a moment to rate our show on any podcast platform that you listen to. Scroll down to the bottom and push 5 stars. It's that easy. And as always, thanks for listening.